So again, welcome everyone. Tonight's talk is on the Nidana Sutta. This is a relatively short sutta where the Buddha teaches the importance of recognizing and abandoning the defilements, greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. And most of us, it's easier said than done. And it's one of the reasons why we use meditation to deepen concentration so that we can recognize these conditioned patterns of behavior that otherwise we tend to ignore. Remember the teachings on dependent origination, that all suffering is rooted in ignorance. We tend to ignore these things, or even if we recognize them, we dismiss them or don't address them in a useful way. And the Buddha teaches a very simple and direct way of addressing these things that arise out of ignorance. But we'll meditate first for 20 minutes. So find your relaxed meditative posture. And gently close your eyes and gently close your mouth. And holding your back straight, but not stiff. Your ears aligned with your shoulders and nose aligned with your navel. But holding yourself very loosely, very gently, very lovingly. Allow yourselves to settle into this room. Settle onto your seats. Settle into your bodies. And settle into your minds. And take a moment to become aware of the sensation of breathing in your body. Just get a feel for what that's like. To be mindful of your breath in your body. And while remaining mindful of your breath in your body, notice that thoughts are flowing. We're conscious beings, thoughts should be flowing. The purpose of meditation is to not be distracted by your own thoughts. So when you find that you're caught up in your thinking again, simply acknowledge that and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. I'll repeat that. When you find that you're caught up in your thinking again, simply acknowledge that and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. Relaxing your thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. And we'll meditate for 20 minutes with callbacks every 5 minutes. Relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. Relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing.
Relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. If a persistent thought or feeling arises, stay with it for a moment or two. Recognize it as impermanent and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. And we'll meditate for 5 more minutes.
Take a moment to notice the quality of your mind. Be at peace with your mind. And when you're ready, you can gently open your eyes. Welcome, Mark. Good to see you. So the Nidana Sutta, remember that everything the Buddha taught for the 45 years of his teaching career was taught in the context of the Four Noble Truths and dependent origination. And that's addressed here too. This sutta is called the Sutta on Ending the Defilements. And in this sutta, the Buddha teaches the importance of being mindful of our actions, much like the Lakkhana Sutta that I'll probably give a talk on that in a couple of weeks here. It is a refined mindfulness that is supported by the deepening concentration developed in Shamatha-Vipassana meditation that the Eightfold Path is established and maintained. So that concentration that we've just developed in our meditation practice is necessary if we're going to be able to hold in mind the refined mindfulness of holding in mind the other factors of the Eightfold Path in order to recognize and abandon the defilements, and also to develop insight in a broader sense to the three marks of existence of impermanence, the not-self characteristic, and the resulting dukkha from the interplay of that. It all rests on, what I'm saying is, it all rests on concentration developed in meditation. But again, it's not just meditation. We need to develop that broader framework of the Eightfold Path. And the Buddha addresses that in the sutta. In this sutta, the Buddha focuses on recognizing and abandoning the three defilements of greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. All three of the defilements are rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths and the resulting ongoing self-referential I-making. Is that clear? And if you look at the greed, aversion, and deluded thinking, it's all an aspect of I-making, isn't it? If we weren't so concerned about continuing to establish and maintain an ego self, there'd be no greed at all, would it? It simply wouldn't arise. And it's every act that we do that's rooted in greed or aversion, and aversion is just the other side of the same coin, isn't it? Greed is wanting to have more of something. Aversion is wanting to have less of something. It's still craving for something to be different than it is. And because we don't understand that process, this is where the three marks of existence come in. This is where true insight is useful. Because we don't understand that process, we literally don't understand what we're doing and why we're creating so much suffering in our lives, that we create that suffering, that dukkha arises. Is that clear? So it's all rooted on, and this is as much importance as we should put on it, because this is all the importance that it deserves, even though it controls our lives. It's all based on a misunderstanding of the true nature of life in the world. All rooted in ignorance. Remember, ignorance is the initiating factor of dependent origination. The sutta is also a simple teaching on conditionality that is often overcomplicated due to a misunderstanding or misapplication of dependent origination. The significant condition is the condition of ignorance that is abandoned through the wisdom developed through the Eightfold Path. So the Buddhist teachings are often taught as a wisdom path, and that's almost entirely true, except there's three factors to it. But we're developing understanding, we're developing wisdom where there was once ignorance. And what type of ignorance is it? The Buddha never taught, and I don't teach, that simply because we're human beings, we're just generally ignorant. It's a very specific type of ignorance. It's ignorance of Four Noble Truths. That's why that was the first sutta he ever taught, and again, to say probably for the 10th time tonight, everything he taught was in the context of Four Noble Truths, so that we can develop wisdom where there was once ignorance. The Buddha uses the metaphor of a healthy and viable seed to show the potential that a well-concentrated mind has to develop awakening or full human maturity. This is the Nidana Sutta, the Buddha's words. Friends, there are three causes for unskillful actions. And an unskillful action is any action that is rooted in ignorance and will only continue ignorance and suffering. Greed is a cause for unskillful actions. Aversion is a cause for unskillful actions, and deluded thinking is a cause for unskillful actions. Any action that is born from greed through conceit or eye-making will bring further confusion and suffering as individual life unfolds. Any action that is born from aversion through conceit or eye-making will bring further confusion and suffering as individual life unfolds. Any action that is born from deluded thinking through conceit or eye-making will bring further confusion and suffering as individual life unfolds. Just as a healthy and viable seed, when planted in poorly prepared soil and attended to improperly, will prove unsatisfactory, in the same way, greed, aversion, and deluded thinking will bring actions that will develop unsatisfactory experiences. If we continue to feed those seeds, what will grow is simply an experience rooted in ignorance. Is that clear so far where I'm going with this? Mindfulness develop. I'm sorry, I skipped a page. The Buddha's words, the Buddha continues, a person ignorant of their own actions, born of greed, aversion, and delusion, must experience the results of their actions. One who has developed wisdom and ended ignorance, this individual abandons greed, aversion, and delusion, and experiences clear understanding and lasting peace and happiness. That's the end of the sutta. A little bit more of my commentary. As stated previously, the sutta also relates to dependent origination. Dependent origination teaches that it is ignorance of Four Noble Truths, that through 12 observable causative links, this all leads to greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. Through the wisdom and right mindfulness developed through the Eightfold Path, the refined mindfulness necessary to recognize and abandon the three defilements becomes possible. So in this sutta, the Buddha is describing the cause of the problem and the experience of the problem. But he's also very quickly giving us a solution to the problem. Now remember, this sutta, like every other sutta he gave, was taught in the context of the Four Noble Truths and in understanding that it's the Eightfold Path that is a path for developing the cessation of this type of unskillful behavior. So looking at the virtuous factors of the Eightfold Path, of right speech, right action, and right livelihood, if we're able to be mindful of that, of the virtuous factors in our actions, in the mundane actions of our life, we'll recognize where greed, aversion, and deluded thinking is taking place. Why? Because we'll have the framework for seeing it clearly. But without that framework, because of something called conditioned thinking, a mind condition rooted in ignorance, remember dependent origination, that mind is conditioned to ignore anything that would challenge its own ignorance. And we simply don't see greed, aversion, and deluded thinking or arising, or if we do, we explain it away, or we justify it, saying, I'm acting this way because the world is this way. I'm acting this way because of how that person is treating me. I'm acting this way simply to survive. When the Buddha first went out in the world and left the palace, one of the things that so shocked him was the competitiveness and the aggressiveness of the people in the town. Simply, these people were simply trying to survive, but they didn't understand the true nature of life in the world. So they became very competitive and aggressive with each other. On a very subtle level, it leads to small conflicts, doesn't it? But on a national level or a global level, it leads to national conflicts. It's the same problem with greed, aversion, and delusion. The brilliance of the Buddhist teaching is he was able to see the macrocosm and the microcosm. He was able to see the individual results of ignorance, and at the same time, the global results. And this is without the internet or Facebook or any of that. When he describes his own awakening, the moment past his awakening, he said, I looked out on the world and the world was aflame. Now imagine that. Imagine that the profundity of that statement from an individual human being waking up in India, in northern India, 2,600 years ago. He saw that the world was aflame. Exactly how the world is today. In that way, it hasn't changed at all, has it? And the problems are still the same. The reason why I'm saying all this is just to point back to the Four Noble Truths. There's something the Buddha taught 2,600 years ago, and they're just as applicable today as they were then. The same. The problem is still greed, aversion, and deluded thinking, known as the Three Defilements. And how do we recognize and abandon that? Meditation practice within the framework of the Eightfold Path. Often, meditation alone, without the framework to recognize the three defilements, will only reinforce that type of behavior because it continues to condition a conditioned mind. Without a proper framework to recognize conditioned thinking, we'll only keep creating strategies to continue that conditioned thinking. Another word for conditioned thinking, more modern term, is confirmation bias. We're biased towards seeing things that confirm the views that we've already established ourselves in. And that really is a problem. When the Buddha awakened, he sat off and on in meditation for another 2 weeks, considering, was there a way to teach what he now understood in a way that would get past that common human problem of conditioned thinking or confirmation bias? What could he do? How can I get past? How do you teach a deluded mind that it's deluded? How do you get past delusion? And even in the Nidana Sutta, he talks about the development of the Eightfold Path is specifically for that reason. And without an Eightfold Path, more than likely, no matter what we do, we're only going to be continuing those strategies to continue ignorance. But with the Eightfold Path, we can directly recognize the process that we've created for ourselves. And this is really a teaching on karma. That ongoing process that we continue to engage, that only continues ignorance. Or if we frame our lives and integrate the Eightfold Path into our lives, now we have a way of recognizing that ignorance and incline our minds towards awakening. And that then points to the potential that each moment of our life has. Each moment holds a potential to turn our minds away from ignorance and develop wisdom and develop awakening or full human maturity. Simply by recognizing these three things that we all have: greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. Most of us don't want to acknowledge that, but it starts there. And it's not that tough. One of the reasons why I say we should be very, very gentle with ourselves is because it's hard. It's easy to start judging ourselves when we start recognizing, yeah, I have a little bit of greed here, or I have some aversion against this thing or that person. It's simply a part of the common human condition. There's no reason to judge ourselves harshly, simply to recognize it. And as the Buddha says, we recognize it, we don't analyze it, we simply abandon it. As it comes up, we let it go. And that's initially an ongoing process, but it's not an eternal process. It's really a period of undoing these clinging views that we've made, recognizing come up. And we've talked recently, I think it was mostly on Tuesday nights, but I've talked about a lot here. We learn where to practice restraint. It's at that point of contact when we recognize these things. So that's the talk for tonight. Thank you. Any questions on this talk? And then we'll go around the room. No, we're good. Mark, good to see you tonight. How's your practice?
Practice is going well. Glad to be here today.
Glad you're here.
Do I have anything else to add? It was a good talk. Always insightful.
Glad you're here. Tim, good to see you.
Good to see you. How's that? Interesting.
Glad you're here. Do you have anything to add to it?
No, I'm still learning everything, trying to understand it. And every time I come here, I get a little bit more. So kind of like an onion, peeling an onion.
Yeah, it's like that. Do you see just in a general way how it relates to the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path?
There was a brief moment Tuesday where you were talking about like going on a ladder. That it started really falling into place and I lost it.
It really does take repetition.
Yeah.
And you can see that the Buddha awakened to dependent origination. He didn't teach it for much later, and it's impossible to determine how much later in his teaching career that he first taught it. But a lot of his suttas relate to it. And the important thing to understand is just that it's from a lack of understanding of the three marks of existence, of the impermanent nature of all things, a lack of understanding of the process we've developed to establish a self, the not self characteristic, and the resulting disappointing experience that evolves from that initial ignorance. So as we develop understanding through the Eightfold Path, we start seeing this thing clearly. One of the reasons why there's a lot of repetition in the Buddhist teachings and here is because of that. You start seeing things clearly. The pieces start falling together.
It doesn't take me as long as his cousin.
Ananda? Well, but even if it does, the important thing is awakening. Ananda was the Buddha's cousin and his attendant for the last 25 years of his teaching career, and he was there for most of his career. And he had a word perfect memory that he likely developed from meditation practice. But yet, even listening to every teaching that Buddha ever taught, Ananda didn't awaken until a month after the Buddha passed. But that's not to say it's difficult. What it really points to is that it's possible for anyone, even Ananda. Now, also remember that Kandana heard the Buddha's very first teaching and awakened on the spot. And the point is, this isn't a race to awakening. It really is a process of developing understanding. There's a term that's often used in Buddhism called a stream enter, and it's usually misapplied to mean someone who is very far advanced and is on the verge of awakening, but that's not how the Buddha used the term. The term stream enter simply means we've been exposed to these incredible teachings, and we're beginning to develop them. And as long as we maintain our presence within the stream of understanding, awakening is assured. And the Buddha continually states that. So it's not so much a race, it's just an ongoing process. And that relates to karma too. Glad you're here. Thank you. Isabel, good to see you tonight.
See you. How are you?
Oh, thank you. I'm good. Thank you for asking.
My practice is, so I haven't been meditating as much as I would like to be this past week. But I'm not judging myself too harshly.
Good.
I'm doing it, and but I am like being honest with myself that it's on my mind and things like that. Like I said, I'm a student, a full-time student, and as much as it's like very helpful for me as well, like with the meditation practice. But sometimes I get really wrapped up and very anxious in my schoolwork and studies that it kind of is a little consuming. So I'm like, I'm just working on that, again, being gentle. But this sutta was wonderful, and I'm very grateful for it today. And
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing all that. It does seem like the busier our lives get, the more difficult it is to find a couple minutes to just sit. But the fact that you're not judging yourself is very important, because if you do, pretty soon you'll get sick of even that. You'll say, I don't even want anything to do with this. So continue to be gentle with yourself. And as best you can, try to squeeze in a couple minutes here and there. It's really, especially in the beginning when we're establishing a meditation practice, it's not so much how long we're meditating. What's most important is that we're meditating, even for just a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. And if you can do that twice a day and be part of our Sangha and develop the broader picture, pretty soon you'll have a practice. But you're here. You're doing what you need to do. So great. Thank you. Nash, good to see you. How are you?
Good to see you too. Doing well, thank you.
Great.
My practice, like Isabel's, is missed a few days, but I find it's not hard for me to just let it go and do it when I can. This doesn't really have anything to do with sutta today, just something I've been thinking about is I find it's really easy for me to recognize clinging thoughts when they're negative. Like when I'm upset about something or I'm annoyed at something, I find it's really easy to recognize them and then to let them go even. Is also easy, but just thinking about things that make me feel happy and thinking to myself, am I clinging to this? Because it is impermanent in the same way that my negative feelings are. And then I think, oh, I don't want to release these like feelings of happiness. Then I think to myself, well, that's me clinging. That's something that's been kind of like, I don't know, just I've been thinking about it. It hasn't been like upsetting me so much, just something I'm trying to figure out about like incorporating Buddhist teachings into my life.
Yeah. So what do you think? Well, I mean, what's your conclusion so far based on that?
Well, that the and I don't know, this is what I've been thinking, and I don't know if this is my like I don't know the word in Buddhism, but my not self, like my saying, like making me want to think that, well, these things aren't causing me to suffer, so it's not something I need to let go of, because that's what the Eightfold Path is about, is cessation of suffering.
Yep.
And so that's kind of my conclusion so far, is that it's not, I don't think it's causing me any suffering. But then it also kind of like leads into, is anything done outside of the Eightfold Path unskillful, or can you like, and not to look back and not be present, but has everything I've done in my life been unskillful because I was unaware of the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths, because I was ignorant of them? But you also said something one of the first days about how when the Buddha heard that his father was dying, he went to his side.
Yep.
And that he would have done the same thing if he was just Siddhartha, that he would have still gone to his father's side.
Yep.
But he did it as the Buddha, as an awakened human being. I don't really know where I go with that, but it just is.
So the only difference there is the quality of his mind, not the actions. I think it was Tuesday night when I was talking about, and it's probably going to happen tonight. We're all going to awaken, and nobody's going to know. How would you know? I mean, you might. I mean, we would carry ourselves, but literally nothing changes except the way that you think. And that points to what we're all doing, and what you're describing wonderfully well, Nash. It's an ongoing process of changing the way we think. And the way we think is also related to how we view ourselves in relation to the world. It's often easier to recognize the things that we do that cause distress in our lives as suffering. But remember the Buddha's description of suffering. Birth is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is, aging is suffering, death is suffering. Not getting what is desired is suffering. Getting what is undesired is suffering. So even when we're in a mind state that is pleasant, if we're attaching ourselves to that mind state is impermanent and will come to cessation. If we're attached to it or creating an identity over it, I need to think this certain way or feel this certain way, setting ourselves up for disappointment, for suffering, aren't we? You looking at it the way you're looking at it tells me that you're really developing an understanding of the implication of this. But you can also take it too far by saying something or looking at something like, geez, my whole life I've been ignorant.
Right.
What is important is to recognize, and this is where a well-concentrated mind is so important, what's occurring right now. Is what's occurring in my life an aspect of something rooted in ignorance, the way I'm seeing things? Or is it something that is well framed by the Eightfold Path? So to answer your question about the Eightfold Path, is everything supposed to be framed by the Eightfold Path? Yes, it is, and no, it's not. Because you can get way too rigid, especially as we develop this. Another reason why we need to be very gentle with ourselves. Let me finish the Buddha's description of suffering. Not getting what is desired is suffering. And he would sometimes include other scenarios, but he would always conclude that statement of a description of suffering as saying, in short, the 5 clinging aggregates are suffering. The 5 clinging aggregates are form, feeling, perceptions, mental fabrications or assumptions, and ongoing consciousness rooted in ignorance. What those, and this won't be a talk on the 5 clinging aggregates, and it's usually a very difficult concept for people to understand, but those 5 clinging aggregates simply describe the ongoing personal experience of suffering. We cling ourselves through these individual components, and if you look at each and every one of those, they're all impermanent in nature. But we describe ourselves by how we feel and the perceptions that are driven by those feelings and the assumptions that are created by those perceptions. So we can even do that within the framework of the Eightfold Path, and we start running around in circles even within this framework. it's enough to recognize at the point of contact, whatever it is, if it's a pleasant feeling, that there's I-making here, if we want more of it, or if it's an unpleasant feeling that we have aversion to. So what you talked about relates directly to tonight's talk. You're having an unpleasant feeling, you recognize it, that's aversion. You have a reaction to it, and you recognize at that point that that's unskillful to continue that. It's much more difficult when something is satiating our ego self to say, well, what's the problem here? This makes me feel good. The problem isn't so much that it makes you feel good in the moment. It's that you create an identity over this is what I need to be happy. And so we do this with all types of scenarios. Some people, I'm a recovered alcoholic, so I attached myself to alcohol for many years. Some people do the same thing with the way that they think. And they create such pleasant scenarios in their own minds that they attach themselves to that. So we can become enamored or attached to anything, including the way that we think. What's most important is to develop a well-concentrated mind so that we can recognize this ongoing process of I-making. So again, by the questions you ask, I can see that you're really developing. But it's not about annihilation. It's simply about recognizing and abandoning all views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. Do you see how the understanding, the developing understanding of the First Noble Truth of dukkha informed the question that you asked yourself?
Yeah, because, and I'm learning that like the language, like ignorance and suffering in the context of like Buddhism is a little bit different than like because ignorance is ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, and then suffering is the result of that ignorance.
Yeah.
And so I'm like not looking at suffering as something bad, but like looking at suffering as something resulted from ignorance of the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah, that's the beginning of right view too. Suffering is simply something that occurs as a consequence of having a human life. And the problem is when we react to that, the problem, and we're creating an identity over that suffering. And again, it's not that we're ignorant human beings, it's that we're ignorant of Four Noble Truths, of simply the nature of human life. And that's a common problem. There's no reason to take any of it personally. And actually none of it is personal. There's not one thing that we can identify in the process rooted in ignorance that is or should be taken as personal. But that doesn't mean we don't have some responsibility for it. In fact, the great understanding, when I first, I won't tell my whole history, but I spent many years in the Tibetan lineage and the Zen lineages after that, getting more and more confused and disappointed as to where is all this going. And it wasn't until I studied the Buddha's direct teachings that it made sense. And when I finally realized the implications of ignorance, it was like it was a great relief, but I also felt a lot of, I don't know if power is the right word, but I'll use it, because now I finally understood that the problem isn't something mystical or esoteric that I have to uncover. The problem was simply with my own thinking. And I felt that now I had discovered the right framework for developing wisdom, that I could do it. And the reason why I could do it is that when I finally understood the Buddha as a human being, which is how he presented himself, and the reason he did it is to show that if he could do it, anybody can do it. And that was very empowering. It was up to me in my own mind by these incredible teachings. So thank you for bringing that up tonight. Greg, welcome to our Sangha. How was your class tonight, your meditation?
This is wonderful. I've been driving by actually 4 times a day. I'm working at the school over there, so I come in the morning and then back to my house, and then back in the afternoon, and then back out. So I keep driving by and I keep saying, I'm gonna stop in there, check it out, see what it's all about. And I'm trying to remain equanimous, but I'm really overjoyed right now. This place is here, and I'm very psyched that it's so close, and yeah, very excited to be part of this.
Thank you. I'm so glad you joined us tonight. There's a word, chanda, C-H-A-N-D-A, which means skillful desire, but I'll call it skillful excitement. You know, I'm glad you're here too. I think we have a class Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and Sanghas sometimes intermix a little bit, but it's really almost three separate Sanghas. The reason why I say that is we're really fortunate what's developed here in Frenchtown. So I'm excited about it too, and I'm always excited when new people join us. So welcome. Kevin, good to see you tonight.
See you, Josh. So, and my meditation practice has been going well. Gosh, it's really astounding the things that Nash brings up, because it's just so,
Isn't it?
Yeah,
it's so stuff that, you know, I've been meditating almost a year now, and stuff that I grapple with still, and I probably will continue to grapple with. And it can be very subtle, you know, it's so subtle. And it's this teaching, though, lays it out pretty clearly, and when you read it and you listen to it, it makes so much sense. But then you meditate, and it seems like concentration is developing really nicely. But then as you go back into life, there are such subtle cravings and such subtle aversions that it's very difficult to have that perfect soil, but it's something that we can all aspire to.
Yeah. Thank you. You're right. It does get to very, very subtle levels, which I guess can be exasperating at times too, when we start realizing, you know, how far it seems like we have to go with it. But ultimately, all of those things that we keep uncovering are like foam on the water. There's really nothing there. There's another sutta, I can't think of the name of it, but we talked about it on our last retreat, where the Buddha uses this metaphor of gardening and tending to the soil, and how important it is that what we put in, what we take in, is what we're going to grow. You know? And again, that's where the framework of the Eightfold Path is. It's not just intention. It's not just meditation, but it's getting to the root of our own thinking. And I think that's really what you described so beautiful, is you've developed very quickly a way of looking at your own thinking, but without becoming overwhelmed at the task at hand, because ultimately it's nothing. What seems like annihilation, like what's going to happen to me, we ultimately understand, well, these are just wrong views that I'm holding. You know, there's nothing there. But because it's all that we think we are, and it's all that we're presenting in the world at some stage of our awakening, it certainly feels like annihilation, doesn't it? But remember, a human being did just this. He let go of all of these views that we are so enamored with. He let go of all of the ways of looking at the world that we're so enamored with. And he became a Buddha. And he taught everyone else who's interested to do the same. That's really why I titled the new book that way. You know, there was some discussion about whether I should even do that. But that's the point. We all have within us the potential to become Buddha, meaning to become awakened. We just have to continue with the path. You know, we have to be willing to, at every step of the way, get into the subtleties of this I-making, this process rooted in ignorance. But ultimately, there's nothing there. And so I used to say this much more often. I should probably start saying it again, that this is a path of ease and joy, but it's not for the faint of heart. You know? But ultimately, there's nothing there. We're not letting go of. And I shouldn't say it like that, because that sounds almost too, I don't know, I'm not putting down that part of Buddhism. It almost sounds too Zen-like, there's nothing there. But it's the ultimate, we can't treat it like that, like there's nothing there, because then we won't address it in the proper way. But ultimately, what we're letting go of is simply views rooted in ignorance. And what is that? That really is nothing. There's ultimately no individual consequence. But if we want to know the consequence of ignorance, look around us.
Yeah.
Because and again, not to be too simplistic, but you could really look at all the ills in the world, and there certainly seems to be a lot more of them now than ever, but they're the same as they were 2,600 years ago. They're all rooted in ignorance, aren't they? Except, you know, this is a good time to talk about this, except worldly causes and conditions. As a consequence of living in the world, there's going to be things that we have no responsibility for, such as hurricanes, but we do have a responsibility for how we react to them. You know, that's the important difference there. And the reason why I say that is that I don't watch a lot of news for, you know, I like to protect what's going on here, so I don't. But I came across someone saying something about people in Texas deserved the hurricane as a part of karma. Like they were, and I couldn't even understand how they could make, but I mean, I've heard that before, even the tsunami in Japan a couple of years ago was somehow. That has nothing to do with karma. That's a complete misunderstanding of karma, for one thing. But most of the things that happen in the world, even around us or to us, really have nothing to do with us personally. In fact, none of them do. But we make them personal by our reaction to them. That's the significant understanding. That's an understanding rooted in wisdom rather than ignorance. We don't take anything personal. And if we cease taking anything personal, then greed cannot arise, aversion cannot arise, and there's no speck of deluded thinking left in our minds. That's what's called an awakened mind, a fully mature mind. Sorry for the second talk tonight, but Kevin got me going.
We rounded it out very nicely.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments about tonight's class?
One thing that, I mean, we've come here a short time, but one thing that has been very helpful is with our discussions is before I react to a situation, whether it's with work or with family or friends, is I think, is my reaction based on conditioned feelings, emotions, and I try to be empathetic. So it's made me shut up more, not saying what's on my mind, you know, but kind of understand. And so if anything, I'm getting that. That's really cool. It makes me feel. I think it ultimately helps with my tranquility.
Oh yeah,
and it reduces my stress.
And so you're seeing very quickly the practicality of these teachings, which is exactly how they should be. These were teachings that were and are entirely practical. They're how to develop a mind of equanimity, a mind that lasts in peace and calm. The Buddha described an awakened human being, the quality of their mind, as calm or peaceful. Nothing magical or mystical, nothing unattainable. And he described that person as release, meaning release from clinging to wrong views. And you're developing that. You know, you've developed already the ability to pause. You know, that's practicing restraint. So thank you for sharing that. Good for you. Please, Isabel.
I was thinking about how these teachings have really been helping me with what's going on with being like a student, and because I'm an online student, so I teach myself everything. I have to like teach myself everything. So it's and I used to go to a campus, so it's like a whole kind of shifted way of doing something. But I notice that even when I'm in the midst of an assignment or reading, I start, like, my mind starts going like, when am I getting to the end? Or what do I have to do after this? And I come back to my breath. And as soon as I do that, it's not even that like anxiety leaves. It's just, it's total concentration, like just understanding that like I had this feeling, my mind was going in this way, and that, I don't know, it just kind of disappears and I can be present in it. Yeah. And I don't know, I'm not really thinking about that either, which makes, but it's like the practicality of these teachings and a vehicle pattern of all of this it's really wonderful.
Isn't it? I mean, it really is. And again, that's the practical application. That's just how it should work out.
Yeah.
You know, and in the moment, you recognize that you were getting mindless. You want to put it that way. You come back to what's occurring.
Yeah.
But it changes everything. You're able to engage in the true cycle of impermanence, meaning the arising. Most of us we don't see it this way, but we in the development of something. But we'll usually start becoming bored or distracted, which is really the same thing. And so we're getting beyond what's going on in our present life. We're missing the passing away of something, or the conclusion of it. And by coming back into the present moment, we're able to be with our life as our life occurs. That changes everything. That brings meaning to every moment of our life. And the reason why is simple, because we're actually here somewhere. We're not in a distraction of dukkha. Thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions, comments? I don't think I have any either. No. We'll finish with metta as we always do. So find your relaxed meditative posture. And gently close your eyes and gently close your mouths. And again, take a moment to become aware of the sensation of breathing in your body. And let that mindfulness of your breath cease any distracting thoughts to the past or to the future, or that may have arisen from our talk tonight. Metta means goodwill or loving kindness. And if I can find it, give me a second. And these are the Buddha's words on metta from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Thank you all for a wonderful class. Peace.